Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my real pleasure to welcome you here today. My name is Tracy Forrest. I'm the director of WISE. And WISE is a multidisciplinary institute on campus. We comprise over 95 faculty and hundreds of graduate students here at the university. And our vision is clean energy, accessible and affordable for all. Today we have an exciting agenda before us. We have two distinguished panels, the first one on shale gas development, and then the next one will begin at noon, and it's on the need for energy innovation in storage. I'd like to point out that we have members of our advisory council here among us today, and I'd also like to give special thanks to our events team, namely Ms. Iris Strickler, for her outstanding organizational efforts. I will now turn the podium over to Dr. Jatin Nathwani, our Executive Director and moderator for Panel 1. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you will enjoy the day.
Thank you, Tracy. Tracy and Iris, of course, to pull this whole Energy Day together. The discussion of the panel today is timely. As any of us in the energy sector who watched the developments could not have predicted 5 years ago, let's call it the shale gas revolution. And so in terms of abundance of energy and how that has shifted the global energy equation is profound. A very important aspect of this, of course, is an yet unanswered question, and perhaps it will evolve, the issues around water, usage of water. Will it or won't it have either liberating or limiting influence on shale gas development? So we've focused this panel discussion. I'm accompanied by eminent scientists and experts in this field, and I will introduce them to you in a moment as we work our way through the panel. The first speaker will be Mel Yedrios. Mel provides an overview of the big picture shale gas story around the world as it stands. Mel's bio you have available, so I will only briefly introduce him to you. He is the executive director of Energy Vantage, a firm specializing in supporting transformation of energy solutions, including global energy policy and strategy. He's active in the natural gas industry, and he's currently the interim president and CEO of the Ontario Energy Association, and other details are in the bio sketch there. Mel, if you would be kind enough to come and share your thoughts with us, please. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jatin, and good morning, everybody. I wear several hats these days. I'm the interim president and CEO of the Ontario Energy Association, but I'm here as vice chairman of the Coordination Committee of the International Gas Union to speak about shale gas. I'm actually the global spokesperson for the International Gas Union on the topic of shale gas. And over the next few minutes, this will likely be the shortest presentation I've ever made on shale gas, but I travel the globe speaking about all issues related to shale gas, including ones that we'll talk about today, those being water. Who is the International Gas Union? Well, it's the global organization that represents the entire value chain of natural gas, from exploration, production, transmission, distribution, and utilization. We have, as you can see, 83 charter members. Those are 83 countries that belong to the International Gas Union, and we also have 39 associate members. Those are typically the multinationals who don't necessarily call one country their home. So that's the union. A reference for you, we have a publication out relating to shale gas. It is a much different publication than what most have seen about shale gas, because what we've tried to do with this publication is to lay it out in a very simplistic way, in a way that someone who is not familiar with the technical terminology or aspects of shale gas can understand what shale gas is all about, and more importantly, contextualize some of the issues and allegations that are placed against shale gas. And we also present a number of best practices that should be adopted relating to regulation and improvement of the environmental performance of shale gas. Now, what is so difficult about shale gas? And this is probably the best way of describing why shale gas is such a difficult formation to extract hydrocarbons from. We're dealing with a formation that has very, very low permeability. In relative comparison to conventional or tight gas, shale is a lot tighter and it is impervious. And just to give you a bit of a contextualization, if you go outside and you think of your sidewalk cement that we use in sidewalks, shale gas is literally hundreds of times harder and more impervious than the cement sidewalk that we walk in. So the challenge is then, how do we extract the hydrocarbons that are in this formation when it's so impervious? And that's where water comes in, that's where hydraulic fracturing fluid comes in, and all of that. Now here is, I'm going to take you to a micro scale now, because I think this is important to understand what the challenge is. This is sort of half of the width of your strand of hair. So this is very, very micro. And what you see here is a cross-section of a shale formation. The light gray is the mineral. In other words, that's the rock. The darker gray is the material that's been decomposing for hundreds of millions of years. That's the organic material. And the dark spots inside the material is where the hydrocarbons are stored. So as decomposition takes place, as molecules of hydrocarbons get formed, they tend to gravitate towards these pores. Now what's unique about this is this, that you see a colony of pores here, a colony of pores on the right-hand side, a colony of pores up on the top left. They're not interconnected. So what we're trying to do with hydraulic fracturing is create a pathway to connect all these pores together and back to the carrier pipe so that those molecules can come to the surface. And that's why we have to stimulate the formation. That's why we have to create micro cracks within the formation to create those pathways. Now, you might have seen some of the pictures from Gasland that show huge gaping holes being created by hydraulic fracturing. I'm sorry, that's not the case, because what we use sand to keep those micro cracks open. So you can, these are very, very small fissures. They're micro cracks. They're not these huge gaping holes that the opposition of shale gas would like you to believe is happening underground. And then what happens is this, that there is a set of characteristics that will ultimately determine if a shale gas formation is economically viable to develop. And it's not a single item. There's a lot of issues here that have to be right in order for shale gas to be economically extractable. Thickness of the formation. Typically, the formations we're dealing with, at least in North America, they're anywhere from 30 feet to 300 feet in thickness. That's the extent of the formation. They happen to be a mile below the surface. So what you're trying to do then is drill down a mile and work within a formation that may be 100 feet in depth. And that has always been the challenge. And innovation has what's led to our ability to be able to extract the resource. It's also that innovation that's creating the concerns that we're going to hear about today. So here's a pretty nice schematic of what really goes on in the shale gas extraction process. You're going down a mile and a half. You're in a formation that's only 100, 200, 300 feet maximum. And the innovation that really broke this thing apart is horizontal drilling. That what we're able to do is not only drill vertically, but we can bend the drill and we can go then horizontally across the formation. And what happens is our pay zone increases significantly. Where the original pay zone, if you only went down vertically, would have been 200 feet, 300 feet. By going horizontally, you can go thousands of feet. In fact, over the last three years, we've started to go from 3,000 to 4,000 to 5,000 feet. And Canna, out west, actually did a horizontal drill 10,000 feet. Now that is a long way to go across. And when you're dealing with a relatively thin formation, you can imagine what sort of technology you need behind it in order to navigate that drill bit in order to stay within the formation. So there's a lot of technology here that generally is not talked about very much. But the thing that broke the thing really apart and loose and made it economic is actually not horizontal or vertical drilling. It's the use of water, and it's hydraulic fracturing. Because before we started to use water, we used to use gels. Gels had a number of problems. They were expensive. They needed a lot of energy, because what you needed to do with the gel is to send it down the hole, spread it into the formation, and then use energy to expand it, and it was that expansion that created the microcracks. With water, we know that we can't compress water. So all the energy you send down with water goes right through. So it's a lot more energy efficient from that perspective. The other issue that gels had, inconsistent results. You didn't know if you were going to get a good frac or not. Water is pretty consistent. What energy you sent down is what happens. Now, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal, it has changed the North American energy scene significantly, and it has the potential to change the global scene very significantly, to the point where right now about 35% of the natural gas in North America comes from shale formations. And this is a phenomenon that's happened over the last 5 years. It has been just spectacular, and we're projecting that shale gas will make up more than 50% of the North American supply, by 2035. And you see graphs like this. They're usually marketing campaigns, and they're estimates of how successful the campaigns are going to be, and they're the hockey stick type of sort of projections that never come true. This is actual data, and this shows you how spectacular the growth in shale gas has been, where it took us 18 years to get to the first 52 BCM of gas. In the next 2 years, we doubled that, and in the next 2 years, we doubled that. I mean, the growth has been just absolutely phenomenal. And of course, it's collapsed price. Price is very low, which is a good thing for consumers. The average Ontario residential customer is paying $400 a year less to heat his or her home. The industrial revolution that's taking place in North America by industries coming back to North America is grounded on the promise of low energy prices through shale gas. We're seeing fertilizer plants come back to North America. We're seeing ethane crackers come back to North America. A lot of any energy intensive industry is coming now back to North America because they believe that in the long term, these prices will stay low. I mean, BASF a couple of months ago, announced that it will move a plant from Germany to Louisiana. And it was a bit of a wake-up call for the German government to now set guidelines about the exploitation of shale gas within Germany. So it's having very fundamental global impacts. Now, water. I'm going to talk a couple of minutes for water, just very briefly. The IEA, in their 2012 outlook, contextualized a bit the issue of water, and that energy consumes about 18% of the global water use. But when you look inside that, and you compare coal, nuclear, and fossil fuels are really a very slight wedge. That's not to say water is not important. Water is very important. But we need to contextualize how much water on an energy equivalency basis is used in the shale formations. Okay, and that's very important. Now, the criticism about shale gas water use is that you're taking large amounts of water out of the ecosystem. Because when you frack something, only about 20, 30% of the initial water you sent down comes back to the surface. And if you dispose that in disposal wells, you're really taking it out of the ecosystem, and that is a legitimate concern. So reuse of water is very important. Accessing water that is out of what we would call our ecosystem is also very important. So what the industry is doing now, for example, is they're going into coal mines, taking the very polluted water from those coal mines, treating it, and using it in the fracturing process. Now, that's the innovation that's taking place that's very important. And here is another contextualization. Nuclear uses a lot of water, coal uses a lot of water. In relative terms, natural gas uses about half of, and this is full life cycle use of water, and that's the source of that report. This is what we do. We recycle now a significant amount of water, but as I said, only 20, 30% of the original water that goes down comes back as flow back. That is recycled, but it has really improved how much demand there is on water. And then globally, this is the big deal, because globally, this resource, there is more technically recovered shale gas around the world than conventional resources. And the value it also brings is that it is not concentrated, it is dispersed. So it's having significant geopolitical implications from a supply and demand perspective, and where people get their gas, and it is changing the global scene with respect to energy policy. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Mel, for setting the context and telling us the relevance of certainly water in this equation. Next up is Professor Maurice Dussault. He is a professor here in geological engineering at the University of Waterloo Earth and Environmental Science Department, and he teaches rock mechanics and oil production methods. Maurice.
Thank you very much, Jatin. I'm going to follow up on what was spoken by Mel with some numbers and some facts. This is one of the maps of the shale gas plays, and the biggest plays in Canada are the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, which contains one of the largest accumulations in the entire world. Alone, it is the #1 in the world. It's huge. And by the way, we haven't even looked in northern Canada yet. I want to remind you of something that Mel did not quite say. Shale gas will give us energy at half the carbon output of coal, at no waste, as opposed to nuclear, at water uses that are a fraction of nuclear and coal, and a very small fraction of corn, which is made into alcohol in Nebraska. Okay, so I'm not saying that this is the salvation of mankind. What I'm saying is that shale gas is a major step on the way from a high carbon world to a low carbon world. Horn River Basin, we'll come back to that. Quebec, lo and behold, Quebec, which has been anti-fossil fuel for a decade, all of a sudden finds out that they have a lot of fossil fuels. The moratorium probably will be canceled in a year or two. And also in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, these are the major areas. And in southern Ontario, there's a small potential, but it is small. The big ones are in the Horn River Basin in BC, the Montney Shale in Alberta and BC, the Colorado formations in Alberta. And here in the east, we have the very substantial Utica Shale all through Quebec, up into Anticosti Island, and then smaller deposits, but still extremely important. These numbers are huge in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Water use. If you're in North Dakota, like here, water has a different impact than if you are, for example, in the middle of the outback in Australia. Here, water is available, but locally there may be issues. In Australia, a cubic meter of water in the central part of the Cooper Basin, where there's a lot of shale gas, has a very different value and impact than, for example, in northeastern British Columbia, where the amount of water available is huge, or the St. Lawrence Valley, again, where the amount of water available is huge. Some of you have heard of the Bakken shale oil development. This is just an example of one of the river valleys there in the Bakken region, and as you can see, the streams are very small. So they have to go to great expense to import water through small pipelines that they lay down so that they do not deplete local water resources. And the amount of water that you use depends upon the zone thickness, the type of fracture stimulation you're going to be doing, a whole bunch of things. We'll just put some numbers down. To drill a well requires on the order of 2,000 to 3,000 cubic meters of water. That's to drill one of these 3-kilometer down and 2.5-kilometer long wells that the previous speaker spoke of. To do a hydraulic fracture treatment of the entire well takes from perhaps 10,000 for a thin zone to as much as 60 to 80,000 cubic meters for the well for a thick zone. So if you have 16 wells on one pad, which is the typical deployment of wells in northeastern British Columbia, it's going to be 1 million cubic meters, which sounds like a lot. It is less than 1 day of Toronto's distribution. And furthermore, that 1 million cubic meters does not comprise 100% fresh water by any means. It is flowback, local saline water. Shell oil, for example, in northeastern British Columbia uses water from the municipal waste treatment plant in Fort St. John for their fracture water for some wells. No, it's not sucking up the fresh water in Canada. That is a view that is promulgated by some ideological websites. It is false. Also, we tend to be tarred by the same brush as the Americans. This is a site in the United States. I want you just to focus on the lower left-hand corner where we have a flowback lagoon where the fracture fluids flow back and are stored in a lagoon. This is not permitted in Canada. And yet we're criticized, not we, pardon me, the industry is criticized for it all the time. It is not permitted in Canada. You have to store the flowback fluids in tanks with environmental barriers around the tanks so that if any tank would happen to spill, there is some degree of containment anyway. So criticize the Canadian industry logically. Don't criticize the Canadian industry on the basis of what is happening in other countries. Our regulatory agencies and our regulatory strength in Canada are substantially stronger than in the United States. I just want to, again, emphasize what the previous speaker said. What's 20,000 cubic meters? Well, that's one average multi-stage fractured wellbore in the Marcellus Shale. Actually, yeah, it's about that, okay, or a small one in Alberta. That's 12 hours of water used for a 1,000-megawatt coal-fired power plant. That's the water used for 4 hectares of corn in Nebraska that might be turned into ethanol. So that wonderful biological degradable fuel that you put into your car has consumed huge amounts of water, not to mention government subsidies. You have to study these things and understand the implications all the way down the line. You can't just say, hydraulic fracturing uses water, therefore it's bad. That is not a tenable position in science and engineering. A golf course in 1 month in Ontario uses that amount of water. And if it's a drought year, they'll use 3 times that amount of water. Okay? It's not the amount used, it's the burden on the watershed. In the Cooper Basin in Australia, you can't find water. So 5,000 cubic meters here for a well would be a huge impact. In northeastern British Columbia, water is available everywhere. Here's a large pad. There's going to be 16 wells drilled here. And you see that pond up there. That is purely a freshwater storage pond. That will never have chemicals in it. Chemicals are retained in tanks that are going to be brought in on site. The Liard Basin, where the Horn River Basin is found, the Liard Water Basin, just to give you a number, if shale gas is developed aggressively in the Horn River Basin, It is less than 1/10 of 1% of the annual flow through. Less than 1/10 of the annual percent. And once you develop a shale gas well with water, you don't go back and get more. It's done. So the impact on the watershed actually is not measurable. However, you can't use local wetlands and local ponds, again, because that has environmental impact. You have to take your water from large sources or from deep saline formations or from recycling the fracture water. Here is the Oil and Gas Commission of British Columbia published this to show you the impact of the oil and gas industry water use compared to other water use in British Columbia. And of course, the numbers would be similar for other jurisdictions in Canada, so the amount of water use is small. So where does the water come from? Groundwater? Never. In Canada, that's not permitted. You can't use groundwater for hydraulic fracturing. Local small ponds and sloughs? No, never. You can't drain a slough or a wetland. From purpose-built borrow pits? Yes. You saw the borrow pit a few slides ago. Yes, seepage water comes in, we can use that. From purpose-built, from lakes and rivers, often. From recycling flowback, local wastewater, for example, Shell Peace River I mentioned, and from deep saline aquifers. So the industry is working towards reducing the impact on any freshwater use, but already the degree of freshwater use is extremely small given the local resources. So criticize the industry for what is a legitimate reason. Do not criticize the industry for imaginary facts, for imaginary issues. The industry has to do it cleanly. We have to be vigilant. But we should focus our vigilance on real issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice. The holy grail of energy policy making is that it should be evidence-based, and so many thanks for pointing out the factual basis for thinking about the challenges on the shale gas developments. Our next speaker is Beth Parker. Beth is a professor at the School of Engineering and director of the G360 Center for Applied Groundwater Research at the University of Guelph. And she also holds the NSERC Industrial Research Chair in Fractured Rock Contaminant Hydrogeology since 2007 at Guelph. Beth?
Thank you, Jatin. Good morning. Hello. I would like to talk to you about the issues from a contaminant hydrogeology perspective, and my experience comes from studying dense chlorinated solvents in fractured rock, and with a particular focus on sedimentary rock and aquatards. And as introduced earlier today, that essentially is what is being fracked to remove this abundant gas resource. But in terms of contaminant hydrogeology, our concern here is protection to our groundwater resources that are in the subsurface, and that freshwater horizon is in the shallowest zone and varies in thickness or extent in various regions across the continent and around the globe. And so I thought I would start with just a summary of what we think the key sources of contaminant threats are to the groundwater resource, and there's association to surface water issues here, given that groundwater and surface water are the same resource. But I break it down into two different components. There's threats from above, and there's threats from below. And as contaminant hydrogeologists, we've been spending 40 years or so honing our discipline and perfecting our technologies for understanding contaminant transport and fate in a variety of hydrogeologic systems. And most of our experience comes from threats from above. So agricultural inputs, municipal inputs, landfills, and so on. And we have some experience with deeper systems, partly because of dense non-aqueous phase liquids, partly because of nuclear waste storage, and now carbon storage, and so on. But we have technologies and we have a discipline expertise that needs to be brought to the table. So when we look here at the threats from above, we see surface impoundments, tanks of chemicals and flowback water that has to be managed. And all of those things are containing chemicals or contaminants of concern. And for the most part, there's a lot of development that's happened at surface to maintain containment or ensure containment, but accidents happen. And I think that essentially boils down to managing things in a systematic and a process control way that I think we more or less understand. What isn't so well understood in terms of the threats from above is what the toxicity and fate of some of these chemicals are in the environment. If they do get released by accident, we probably need to improve our understanding of that toxicity and fate. And perhaps treatment, improving our technologies for treating the constituents in that flowback water or waste that eventually is generated into the, as part of the system. But I suppose, so I guess what I'm saying in a nutshell is those sources and pathways perhaps are well recognized, and we can manage them with good, sound engineering and scientific practice. The contrast here is the threats from below, and these are largely unknown. And I think it's fair to say that the likelihood of these various pathways is probably different from pad to pad or from play to play. And I think even though I've numbered up to 8 of these various combinations of pathways here, there's some that are more likely to be a problem than others. So, for instance, I guess what we're pointing out here is there's a well integrity issue due to poor seals, either poor placement of seals or the degradation of seals that others in the room here are much more experts on. But the fact that we have learned that these seals can be an issue is something we have to factor into the prospects of improving our containment and management of this shale gas activity. And then what I'm also showing here is that they're natural pathways. Sedimentary rocks are fractured. These fractures may be nearly closed, but not completely closed. Those pathways, either on their own or in combination with poor well seals, can help to provide pathways from the intermediate zone that contains stray gas, or perhaps from deeper zones, maybe not directly from the production zone, but in some cases we might have to think about that as well. So I'm showing the presence of through-going faults. I'm showing the presence of abandoned wells or ancillary boreholes that might exist in the area. And the integrity of this well seal is all part of the unknown pathways. And I think the integrity of the aquitards between the production zone and the freshwater zone that may be a few hundred feet to several 100 feet thick, we need to think about the degree of containment and assimilative capacity of this intermediate zone that we really know nothing about. So contaminant hydrogeologists have become experts in the freshwater zone, and petroleum geologists and engineers are experts on production zones or reservoirs, and we really just ignore what's in between. So that brings me to this slide that shows our freshwater zone near the top, our production zone here at depth, and there's considerable thickness here with interlayers of sedimentary rock with varying properties that we're relying on faith, essentially, that provides the integrity that we need to protect the freshwater zone from the threats from below. And what's the time scale for these migration pathways to be realized by buoyant gas or by the fracking fluids or production waters and so on? Although I think the biggest threat perhaps is the stray gas moving up through the system. So this is just a view of a layered sedimentary rock sequence with shale beds and the variability in the fracture network that we've come to realize in the upper 1,000 or 2,000 feet, which is the freshwater zone that we're studying in some of the parts around the globe. So there's not much that we know about this intermediate zone. There's much that we can learn, and a lot of it depends on technologies that have been developed by the petroleum and gas industry. But my experience says that we usually have to adjust those technologies or tweak them to be able to answer the contaminant hydrogeology questions. So research is needed, and characterization is probably needed so that we can improve our designs of these vertical and horizontal wells and so on. Anyway, the thickness and the depth of these production zones and the intermediate zones, associated intermediate zones, varies across the continent. So we just looked at North American shale gas plays and their depth range, typically 5,000 feet, but we have some that are only a few hundred feet below ground surface, and the thicknesses of these shale gas plays. And if I show you a map, which is typical and consistent with the other maps that have been shown this morning, we see that there's lots of variability in the depths of these production zones that are targeted, and that essentially can be translated to thinking about the thickness of the intermediate zone that we're relying on for protection. And that brings me to monitoring. And currently, the standard practice for groundwater resource monitoring is relying on existing domestic wells, commonly domestic wells. Those are private wells. They can vary in age from a few years to maybe 100 years or so or more. And they're shallow wells that have been designed to provide fresh water to a household. And municipal wells are also reasonably shallow wells in that they're designed to provide a sufficient amount of water to the community that it's trying to supply water for. It doesn't necessarily characterize the system or bring us to the depths of the freshwater zone. But I've listed different types of monitoring that are relevant here from a shale gas perspective, and perhaps any transferable from other systems. Performance monitoring, if we think about it from threats from below or threats to the groundwater zone, we're interested in the performance of the fracking or the drilling operations or the sealing that goes on along the vertical pipe. And so we're interested in knowing that, in fact, the dynamics of that system haven't altered those flow pathways in the short or in the longer haul. So there's an issue of monitoring that is relevant to building the confidence or reinforcing the confidence we have in those aquatards providing the protection. I guess containment of those fracking fluids and so on in those production zones is what we're assuming is happening, and I think we can verify that that in fact is the case. Receptor monitoring is what we're doing now, but we're only thinking about the groundwater resource from a domestic well perspective. So the receptor that we're monitoring is that existing well. And the groundwater resource itself is a receptor. So how do we improve the robustness of our receptor monitoring so we're actually evaluating the impacts to that freshwater resource, which is connected to surface water resources? So I think we have to go beyond existing water supply wells and think about the aquifers themselves. And then what comes to mind when we think about protecting these freshwater aquifers, it would be useful for us to do sentry monitoring so that we actually see when those fluids or contaminants of concern or gases, which may be the biggest threat, are approaching that freshwater resource as opposed to waiting for it to have arrived. And we call that sentry monitoring. And we have lots of technologies available to us to improve our ability to monitor, probably at different spatial and temporal scales. And this slide is just here to show the unreasonableness, really, of using existing water supply wells that are of varying construction type, shallow in the system, and yet we've developed over the last 40 years robust multi-level systems that give us profiles of the system that we're interested in understanding. This is a conventional monitoring well developed and codified, I suppose, in our ASTM and regulations, but this is designed for threats from above. So it's not really what we need in entirety in this system. I just wanted to bring our attention to the development of multi-level systems is well-developed technology in the 1970s, and this is done from both a geotechnical and from an environmental perspective. And Frank Patton started a company in Vancouver, so it's good Canadian technology, and we've deployed this in environmental systems for many decades. So we have the ability to very efficiently or cost-effectively do multiple depth monitoring in the subsurface. to very considerable depths. And what do we get from multi-level monitoring? We get high-resolution vertical profiles of various parameters that we need to track in the system. So I'm showing a schematic plot of concentration versus depth, which might be gas distribution or perhaps contaminants of concern. We can also do hydraulic head or pore pressure and so on. And this can help to inform us of that system. So I believe this is more or less my last slide. Schlumberger owns this multi-level system, and they've been advocating the use of these systems to robustly monitor the various aspects of the system that concern us in a shale gas perspective. So with that, I'll say thank you and appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Beth, for pointing out the gaps in knowledge around the intermediate zone and, of course, the importance of monitoring. Our next speaker is Richard Jackson. Richard is a registered professional geological engineer both here in Ontario and British Columbia. He obtained his PhD here at University of Waterloo and completed a 15-year career at Environment Canada by becoming the chief of the groundwater contamination project at National Water Research Institute in Burlington. Richard?
Thank you, Jatin. Good morning. I am going to try and summarize the thoughts of Maurice and Beth in my own way. As Beth has pointed out, the problem we have in contaminant hydrogeology or in groundwater resources protection is that we're used to contamination threats that arise on the surface. And what has been striking about the shale gas development issue is that these threats are, well, there's a few on the surface, and they're rather typical things, tankage, perhaps some ponds, as Marie says. Some of these storage ponds are particularly common down in the States and not here. But the striking difference is the fact that we have this potential source of contaminants that may under some circumstances be caused by releases at great depth, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers down. There has not been really any exploration of this problem except in nuclear waste disposal. And Geothermal Engineering is based in Ottawa and has had a long history of working with the nuclear industry in looking at issues arising from the potential release of dissolved radionuclides in groundwater, or quite often gaseous radionuclides that arise from nuclear waste storage disposal at depth. So we were the group that conducted, on behalf of Ontario Power Generation and the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, the characterization, a $30 million characterization of the low-level and intermediate-level repository at the Bruce site that is undergoing a joint panel review at this time. It started a couple of weeks ago. It's going to continue later this month. But at least in nuclear waste disposal, we knew we had a deep source, and we had to try and understand how to monitor that any potential releases in the shallow subsurface. So we came at this from familiar territory, you might say, from a familiar conceptual model. And Maurice has drawn this figure that I think is similar to what Beth has shown, but it shows the many different kinds of potential sources or pathways of groundwater contamination that may occur in certain cases unless they are prevented. As you can see, the ones at the top here these are rather traditional ones that we know, as Beth pointed out, quite a lot about. And regulation and monitoring and inspection can do much to minimize. So those are issues that are well within our capability of minimizing the threat from contamination. But you can see up here we have a potable groundwater system, an aquifer. And beneath that, we have a variety of potential sources of natural gas that may leak by one pathway or another, numbered 1 through 10 here. My role has been as adjunct professor in the Department of Earth Sciences, has been to work with Maurice on looking at these issues, and we are under I wouldn't say under contract. We received a grant from a senior Canadian government agency earlier this year to try and develop a technology roadmap to look at issues about those that concern essentially 4, 7, and 9 on the other side of the, these ones over here, 4, 7, and 9. Essentially the leakage pathways that are associated with the wellbore itself. It might be the absence of cement around the casing, or it may be the fact that the cement has shrunk over time and has allowed a microannulus to form between the casing itself and the rock, or that there are some problems with the drilling shoe or certain packers that are put in place to prevent annular gas migration. We consider these by far the greatest concern with respect to groundwater contamination and potential greenhouse gas emissions at the ground surface. So it's these ones in the center of the picture here that, let's see if that works. Oh, there we go. These ones here that we concern ourselves mostly about. 7, gas seepage from thin zones like this one here. 9, production zone gas seepage. Perhaps somehow the production tubing has not been centralized properly when you deviate the well here, and there has been mud, drilling mud left in place that was not flushed out. When the cement penetrates, when the cement is in place, there's still drilling mud there, and that can cause a leakage problem. So there are problems there, but most often we believe it's this thin intermediate depth gas zones that cause releases through the well, through the surface casing vent at the well, or gas migration outside the casing and turning up the ground surface. So this results in these 3 issues: fugitive gas release from the production well, short-circuiting, and fugitive gas release in structurally deformed areas, which I'll just mention, but Beth talked about. So we have the ones around the casing, and as you can see, gas migration, which is outside the casing, and surface casing vent flow up here. These have plagued the industry for decades. Public data suggests 18,000 of these in Alberta alone. This is not from Greenpeace. These folks are with Schlumberger. So this is a real problem, and we've got to fix it. There is an occasion, on a few occasions, there have been short-circuiting between production wells during the hydraulic fracturing process. This should be easily prevented by due diligence. In this case here, in Innisfail, Alberta, the frackers, the group that was fracking this horizontal well got within 140 meters of a producing well. You can see it up here, and caused a blowout. The blowout came around the casing. That wasn't actually illegal at the time. It would be now in Alberta, but that is preventable by doing due diligence on how close you are. And in the Barnett Shale in Texas, they found if you're within 200 meters of an offset well, like this one here, you should not be stimulating by hydraulic fracturing. And finally, the point that Beth brought up was this potential discharge due to fault zones and associated fracture systems. This is the picture of, I believe it's a blowout near a shell well in the Marcellus Shale, and the discharge was through an abandoned borehole that was, I think, of the order of about, this abandoned borehole was something of the order of 1,000 to 2,000 feet away from the well that was being stimulated by hydraulic fracturing. So these are the issues we're concerned with in terms of the technical issues of groundwater protection that we have to consider. The most serious one is the well itself. We are, at least Maurice and I, are not particularly concerned with hydraulic fracturing stimulation itself, as long as it's done 500 meters or deeper. There can be some problems as you come shallower, but and that has been only that has been the history that has well, there have been events in coal bed methane fracking in Alberta that have caused some problems. So I will finish on that point. One thing I haven't touched on that is really critical here is the issue of the social license, quote unquote, to proceed with shale gas development. And that really means public acceptance of such an engineering project, just like there is a problem with social license and nuclear waste disposal, or developing quarries around southern Ontario. These all require some degree of public acceptance, and none of us have actually touched on that, but it is one of the most important issues that we have to face. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. We have some time for questions from the audience, and I'd like you to be as brief as possible, or if you have a comment or an observation, please feel free. So we'll go for about 15 minutes or so. Yes, Keith.
Four excellent presentations. Thank you very much. You gave a really good summary, let's say, of the technical environmental issues. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the value added. Maybe this is close to your social license. Will there be a lot of extra activities that really benefit Canadians, such as a new chemical industry starting in Alberta or whatever? I wonder if you could make some comments about that, please.
Directed to anyone, or
Anyone up there.
perhaps Mel or Richard?
Natural gas in the United States is replacing coal. This will take a generation. Natural gas, for the same unit of energy, puts out 50% only of the carbon dioxide of coal. And the mining does not happen. So there's no environmental impact from mining. The actual surface disturbance from shale gas development is quite minor. Like you saw that pad with 16 wells. There's only one of those for 5 square kilometers. So the impact is remarkably small compared to traditional oil and gas. Burning natural gas in vehicles, in power plants, or for home heating emits almost no particulates, almost no nitrogen or sulfur gases whatsoever, in contrast to coal, diesel fuels, gasoline. So the environmental impact of natural gas is far, far less than all of the other fossil fuels. So, because solar and wind and other renewables are not yet viable economic alternatives, even at 3 times the cost, natural gas, in my view, will serve as a very valuable bridge to get off of the high carbon into a low carbon future. So that has huge value. More explicitly, in British Columbia and Alberta, liquefied natural gas exports from the West Coast to South Korea, Philippines, Japan, China present a large economic opportunity for those provinces. Less so in the eastern part of Canada. Locally, in Quebec, natural gas development will provide fossil fuels from Quebec for Quebecers. So again, a very large economic impact as opposed to importing from Alberta and BC. In fact, Alberta and BC will not be exporting natural gas to Eastern Canada within 5 or 6 years. It'll all come from the United States or local sources. So the economic impacts are huge. I mean, really big. Another spin-off is that in Quebec and Manitoba, major producers of hydroelectrical power, they have been forced to reduce their prices substantially for their clients in the United States because the clients are just simply saying, if you don't reduce your prices for hydropower, then we're going to build a natural gas-fired power plant and basically undercut what you're charging. So that has had a negative impact for those two provinces in terms of what price they can get for their electrical power. These changes are just huge, Keith. They're really impactful. Yeah.
Thank you. Perhaps, Mel, if you want to add, so we recognize the environmental benefits and, of course, the economic prosperity aspect that Maurice has outlined. Anything else you want to add to that?
Well, what I want to add, I want to just take it to perhaps a different level. As you go around the world, energy policy is typically around three-legged stool. It's about the environment performance or sustainability of the system. It's about affordability, and it's about security of supply or reliability, however you want to call it. And you can get into real trouble if you don't keep that balance in a three-legged stool. And the wonderful thing about shale gas is it gives us that opportunity to move down the sustainability path, reducing carbon while we can afford it. And it's not a huge burden on the ratepayers who will ultimately have to pay for this. And when you get into an economic sort of environment where things are very sensitive the way they are today, you get some distortions that go on. The emissions in North America have significantly declined over the last 5 years. The emissions in Europe, and Europe is sort of the home of climate change, have actually increased, even with a carbon price. And you say, how could that be? Well, how could that be is that cheap North American coal that is being displaced is now finding a home in Europe. And you're getting conversion from natural gas power plants now back to coal because it's a cheaper resource, because they've gone so far ahead with the renewable side that affordability is a real issue now. So everything's interrelated. We all want a cleaner future. We all want a less carbon-intensive future, but we need to get there in a way that is affordable, that builds on the security of supply and all that. It has to all be balanced.
Thank you for pointing out to this really perverse effect that has happened in the global energy markets, that clean gas, and you get more coal emissions, big carbon emissions in so-called clean Germany. So anyway, that's an interesting point that you raised. Yes, Ken.
So currently, natural gas is, when you look globally, prices are quite regional. And I've heard some discussions that perhaps there is the ability to move natural gas globally. In fact, before shale gas, there was discussions that might move to import natural gas by LNG. Could always turn that around, create an export, and yet I see that the shale gas opportunities around the globe are quite distributed. Do you ever see a day when natural gas becomes a global price rather than regional price?
Yeah, I mean, there's a movement that way. It's a slow movement, I would say. It's going to take a while. For sure, it is. There are very distinct regions and pricing within those regions that varies significantly around the world. Outside of North America, most of the LNG, in fact, all of it is oil indexed. Most of the supply into Europe is oil indexed. And of course, that moves with the oil price. We'd like to move to a world where there's gas-to-gas competition around the world. I think by 2020, assuming the projections around export of LNG from Canada and the US do happen, and we get 8 to 10 BCF of gas in the LNG market, it will have an impact in resetting LNG pricing. That'll be about 10% of the global demand that comes in from North America. But it's post-2020 that we're going to fundamentally see a movement away from the current pricing environment and oil indexation. It's not a short-term issue. It is more of a long-term issue.
So in the short term, it's a bit of a competitive advantage for North America,
Huge.
but it will grow.
Well, no, because what's interesting is that the U.S. LNG will be the only market LNG that is based on domestic pricing and not international pricing. Canadian LNG will have to be priced at international levels, predominantly because everything's greenfield and it just costs so much more to get it out the door, if you may. Whereas in the US, there's a lot of brownfield sites that are being reconverted to move gas out versus in, and it'll be based on Henry Hub pricing. So the whole model in the US is the only model in the world that will be based on domestic pricing. And how the contracts are going to be laid out is that you're going to be buying your supply at Henry Hub, bringing it to a liquefaction facility, and you'll be paying a price to get it liquefied and shipped out. And this gives us a North American hedge then, that if the price begins to increase here, then there'll be more value to that gas to simply resell it into this market than liquefy it and send it out. So we're having a natural hedge. There's no doubt that the current pricing is not sustainable. It's the $3, $3.50 range. In the long term, we're going to see $4 to $6 gas, whether it's $5, whether it's $6, I don't quite know. But that's sort of the range that people are making scenarios around, not $3, because that is unrealistically low.
We have time for perhaps 2 questions, 3 to 5 minutes now, Keshav, and then after that.
So the two sets of presentations, one was on the great value, economic value, and then the other on the potential risks, brings to mind essentially a private versus public good issue over here. The benefits or the profits are going to accrue to the owners of these resources, oil and gas companies, and the problems are going to be inherited by the people living nearby, the public, right? It seems to me that whenever in the past you've had private gains contrasted with public goods, the private gains are the one that wins. So what we need to do here apparently is to make sure there's a sufficient amount of regulation and taxation so that you can have the scientific research to see that things aren't going wrong, right? And so that doesn't seem to be happening. I was wondering if there's any movement in regulation that says, 5% of your profits must go into research.
I've asked that I should repeat the questions for the purpose of recording. The essence of the question is the private versus public goods. The gains to the private companies are, of course, through exploration and exploitation of this resource, potential downside risks around threats to society, and so how do you arbitrate between those two? Any comments?
The gas resources of Canada are not owned by private companies. Fossil fuels in Canada are owned by the people through their governments. When a company undertakes to develop a resource, first of all, they have to buy the rights. And that's just the rights to explore. Once they start developing, they have to pay royalties. Those royalties go into provincial coffers, or if it's federal land, into federal coffers. Then there are additional taxes and tariffs, all the way from corporate taxes to income tax on jobs to perhaps taxes on production to meet certain goals. For example, Dr. Jackson talked about wellbore leakage. In Alberta, every cubic meter of gas that is produced has a small tax put on it. Every barrel of oil that is produced in Alberta has a small tax put on it, and that tax money goes into a pool called the Orphan Well Program. So that money is intended to cure or address problems of an environmental nature. On top of all that, we have got one of the soundest regulatory agencies in the regulatory environments in the world. The Alberta Energy Regulator is the model for the world. In fact, countries in the Middle East and South America come to Alberta to study it. And the models in British Columbia and in Saskatchewan are based largely on what the Alberta Energy Regulator has done over the years. Do they have a perfect system? Of course not. It evolves all the time. Dr. Jackson pointed out that 2 years ago, fracturing near another well was legal. Now it is not, without certain steps. This is an evolving thing. We need public input to all of our regulatory deliberations. To inform yourself, go to the AEB website, the Alberta Energy Regulator, AER, sorry, and you'll see more information there than is available anywhere else in the world on guidelines, regulation, environmental restrictions, how you have to apply, what taxes you have to pay, etc. Remember, you own the resource, not the oil company. We give the oil company the right to develop it under our rules and our taxes.
In light of our time constraint, Mel, would you like to just add to that?
Just to confirm what we're saying, I travel all over the world, and the one thing I tell governments is, I know you want to try and emulate the U.S., but if you want a role model, come to Canada. Don't look at the U.S. 32 different states with a multitude of different regulations that are not as mature as the Canadian regulations. Our rights are owned by the government, not by the individuals, the way they are in the U.S. So please, whether I'm in Algeria, Argentina, wherever, I say come to Canada to look at the model. Don't go to the U.S.
I'm sure our Honorable John Wilkinson, our Minister of Environment, or ex-Minister of Environment, will confirm that. John, you have a question.
Well, I do. I mean, because environmental policy and regulations is built and should be on a precautionary principle. So what I've heard here is all the potential. I've heard where there are gaps in knowledge. So in other words, there is not scientific evidence that would give us caution, or that give us the reassurance that we need, because you identify these gaps. So the question I would have is, you have to look at the consequence, the probability, but also what is the consequence? So if there is contamination from deep below into our aquifer that we drink from, is there, and the probability may be low, but the consequence may be high in the sense there would be no way to actually reverse that.
Okay.
Right?
Good.
Because, there's plenty of examples. If you have surface contamination, you can do something about it because we're all on the surface and we deal with it. But if for somehow those chemicals are able to get themselves up to the aquifer through these fractures, there'd be no way to stop that, right?
Good.
It's kind of what I'm hearing.
An excellent question.
So
Let me repeat.
It's not the, I need to know how probable it is, but I also need to know what is the consequence. In other words, if that happens, there's nothing we can do about it.
I will repeat that question just for the recording. An important question raised by John Wilkinson here is the notion of the understanding between the probability of the particular event occurring may be low, extremely low, very low, but the consequence could be quite high. And so what are your reflections or thoughts on things that have a very high consequence for which there may not be any obvious solutions?
If I may respond to that very interesting question, the consequence is likely to be quite local, and by that I mean it would be likely within 100 meters of a leaky gas well. It would not be regional. And the reason is couched in because you have a single source, probably not emitting fracking fluids. The likelihood of fracking fluids coming to the surface from depth, from great depth, 1 kilometer or more, is very low. It's the gas that itself is buoyant. Now, the gas can contaminate an aquifer, cause an effect that we have seen with other hydrocarbon contaminants, particularly gasoline from service stations that leaks. And we know how the sequence of events that happens. This is a very undesirable event, agreed. But where it has occurred, it's often been able to have been reversed over the course of several months with some intervention by geoscientists and engineers. So I would say it's going to be a local problem, very serious, of great concern to those homeowners, no question about it, but not likely to be a regional problem.
That's an important distinction. Thank you for drawing that one
I'd
out.
like
Beth,
to
you have something to
add to that. I think the comment maybe is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I think we've learned that over and over again in a contaminant hydrogeology perspective and perhaps environmental impact perspective over the last many decades. And I guess I agree with what Dick has said, that there's perhaps in our general conceptual model of the relative risks and so on, I think there's a prioritization of where those risks are probably most likely. But it's speculation, and I guess to some extent, the technology exists for us to inform our judgment much more than what's being practiced. So I think there's an opportunity for us to advance the knowledge base and make informed risk assessments as opposed to speculation risk assessments. And I think we can do that cost effectively. Many of the technologies that we use in our subsurface characterization for environmental management come from deep oil and gas technologies, but they have to be modified or adjusted. But I think there's lots of synergy that can happen between those disciplines to improve that knowledge base. And I guess I think the other aspect is it's going to vary from play to play or from region to region. And we have to factor that into our subsurface
Thank
knowledge
you.
development.
Thank you, Beth, for that observation, and I'd like to bring this session to a formal close here in light of the time constraints. So if you would be, no, let me first point out to you, this is Energy Day here at Waterloo, so there are posters in the session here in the, what do we call this room? Fishbowl. Refreshments, cookies, and so on. And this is also an opportunity for you to sign up for lab visits. There are quite a number of energy research labs here at Waterloo, and it's an opportunity to go see some of them. And also, I would like to invite you to come back at noon for our next panel discussion, which is on the subject of energy storage technologies and the need for innovation in that sector to help support changing energy mix. But if you'd be kind enough to join me in thanking our excellent panel of speakers here. So please do come back at noon for the next panel.